This is the API Intersection, where you'll get insights from experienced API practitioners to learn best practices on things like API design, governance, identity, auth, versioning, and more. All right, welcome back to API Intersection. I am super excited about today. I've been looking forward to catching up with Jay Jenna from PayPal. He and I worked together, 7-8 years ago now. And as usual lately, we've got Adam Duvander as our co-host. I guess, Adam, tell us a bit about yourself, and then Jay, give us a little inkling as to what you've been doing at PayPal the last 7 years.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. I work at Every Developer, where we work with API companies to engage them around APIs, engage developers around APIs. And what's particularly interesting today to me is that PayPal has a huge API program, which includes external and internal programs. And Jay seems to be the guy to be able to take us through the state of that program today and its progression there. So, Jay, good to have you.
Yeah, thank you, Jason, Adam. Pleasure. Thank you for having me. We'll take you through everything that we have done at PayPal. And Jason, nice to talk to you again after so long.
Yeah, for sure. And I should point out too, Jay has much more background than just PayPal. I know you did quite a bit of stuff at Cisco around kind of APIs and service infrastructure and all that too, right?
Yeah. So prior to joining PayPal, I was in Toshiba R&D Labs. I was doing their private cloud, where we had to integrate with lot of vendors, be it the storage provider or be it the compute provider. So, which involved working on a lot of APIs, integrating APIs, together, and creating that solution for the customer, right? And prior to Toshiba R&D Labs, I was in Cisco, where I was working in a group that was customer facing, and the network management services that Cisco provides as solutions or API to its customer, and for partners to manage Cisco network on behalf of Cisco in Cisco's customer network. So API was the core theme there, and those are the most important items for I would say artifacts or services or products that could help partners manage the Cisco network effectively and keep it up all the time. So yeah, Cisco and Toshiba. Toshiba is where I did a lot of APIs before joining PayPal.
Yeah. So I guess history lesson for listeners here. So I worked at PayPal on kind of the API program. I guess it was like 2013, 14 kind of ish, which for me was very much the intro to what large scale API design looks like. Had the privilege to get to do, API design as a dedicated function for a year or two. Jay joined my team at the time, and then when I went off to do some other things, Jay basically took the helm of that API design stuff and kind of, took the torch that I'd lit and ran with it. But I know it's like I think I brought the perspective of like, fresh, naive guy on, this is how we build good APIs that kind of worked. But guys like Jay, coming from, much bigger enterprise background, understood much more like the big enterprise-y stuff, that like I just wasn't from that world as much. I mean, I had done some AT&T time and things like that. But anyways, Jay and I have a lot of great history together. I've touched over the years on some kind of open source HTTP, IETF kind of bits here and there. And it's just a pleasure to get to see where you've taken all this. So I guess one more history tidbit is like that. I guess it was probably 2012 to 2013-ish was kind of the establishment internally at PayPal of a program called PayPal as a Service.
Right.
Which basically was kind of the governance function, essentially. But I know since then, probably a ton of that's changed. And the last tidbit, and I'll stop soapboxing here, is that what you see on PayPal's developer portal, as far as public APIs, is a tiny sliver of what the overall API portfolio looks like inside. So if you ever spent time at API developer conferences, it's the tip of the iceberg. That stupid slide that we all drink to. Adam, you've definitely played that game before. So I guess the point is that there's probably two sides to our discussion at the very least, which is kind of the internal governance function and the publishing aspect of that, the kind of sharing how it all works, and then the external developer program side, which is kind of a different deal, and certainly more Adam's world than mine. So Jay, I guess taking us maybe through a little bit of how that stuff works, as generalities, and maybe let's start there, and then we can kind of we'll poke at how things have evolved from that point.
Yeah. So to start with, Jason, so when you and I were working together at PayPal, we were starting the API program. It was new, and the focus more was to break the monolith and get into a mode where make the teams more agile and deliver faster. So we started with that approach, and we ended up building a lot of APIs, right? So when we started, our goal was to how to establish a consistent set of guidelines for our developers to follow and develop APIs. And soon we realized, being part of the central team, the more APIs we did, we could see that we were becoming bottleneck for other teams, all right? And that used to slow other teams in terms of delivering within the timeline. So what our next focus was, how do you federate that function, right? So what we did was we created a training program, and we hired people or nominated people from other domains, trained them to do the API design along with us. So we started doing that. But what I learned over a period is, like, you spend, say, 6 months to 1 year training a person from a domain, then suddenly you realize the person has changed the role, right? The team, he started doing something else, and you lose that person, right? So, and it happened many times. So then my focus was, this is not a way to scale, right? And you cannot spend so much time to train someone, then suddenly you lose. So my focus, I started focusing on how do I scale this as a program. So establishing a process, a framework, set of guidelines, and the tooling was very important. To start with, when we started, the most important thing that we have done is creating that customer-centric view of your business, right? That is very important. So what it means is what PayPal means to its customers, why customers come to PayPal, what they want to do when they think of PayPal. So when we started, we created a business capability model, which is comprised of all the product capabilities that PayPal offers to its customers. So that defined the problem space for anyone, both internally, externally, to develop APIs. So when any developer, be it product manager, for all stakeholders looking at the business capability model, we make sure that every API that we develop, it delivers a business value to the customers, what we call portfolio alignment. So we'll talk about all of those in detail, but establishing the business capability model was the first important step. And once we did that, then we establish the process, how to take an API from concept to launch, what it means to take an API from concept to launch, and what are those phases, what are those exit criteria, entry criteria for those phases, right? What it means to complete each phase, and who are the stakeholders that are responsible for each of these phases. So what we define is what we call at PayPal is the API PDLC, right? We'll talk about that in detail as
What
well.
does PDLC stand for?
The product development lifecycle, API product development lifecycle. So we have like 4 phases: define, design, develop, and deploy, and the exited entry for each of those phases is driven by API maturity model, what we call. So API maturity model essentially consists of a set of criteria that drives on what it means to complete a particular phase. What are those criterion? So and at the end of it, when you complete all the phases and go to make your API live, you are essentially assigned a API maturity for your API. So based on how you meet those criteria, your API quality is assigned. So we talked about business capability model, then the API PDLC. Now the next thing was how.
Before you get to the next thing, sorry, Jay, can you say the 4 stages again?
Yeah. So we have define, design, develop, and deploy. So define is our first goal always is how to build a framework where we make everyone think from customer standpoint, bring that customer centricity to everything that we do in an API, right? So the define phase of our life cycle, the API PDLC just does that. So in the define phase, there are artifacts that we expect, and particularly from the product manager who knows the business in that domain, who is an expert. We expect an artifact where the product manager describes things like, why do you need this API? And if we build this API, how does it stand in that overall PayPal product portfolio? What business value does it deliver? What is the developer experience that is going to change because of this API, or how the developer benefits? Who are the target audience? And what are the security privacy implications of this API? So this is the document our product managers provide when they propose the API. So the define phase starts with proposing an API and by providing all this documentation. So once we see, then it comes to the PPaaS team, which is the central team, looking at those documentation, those API proposals, then evaluating that API proposal against our business capability model, which defines our products, the business functions. Then making a decision in collaboration with the domain architect and the domain product manager on whether we should do this API. Does this bring any business value, and how this is going to help PayPal or the PayPal product portfolio overall?
And Jay, I want to just pause for a second, because I think there's some scale things to keep in mind across this kind of timeline that you're referring to these things. At the beginning of kind of this program, I know at the time there was something like 20 people working on this. But when you break that down, you've already mentioned there's product managers in that first step. And I think this is somewhat unique. In a lot of places, you hear that like there's architects who are working with engineering teams on what the API is going to be. Actually, a lot of the process stuff you're outlining, Eric Hogan, who's run that at PayPal now for many years, actually published a pretty good series on InfoQ.
Right.
If you look for untangling an API PayPal on InfoQ from Eric Hogan, there's a 3-part blog series which I've shared with so many people that really walks through the outlines of at least what this looked like then, which sounds like it hasn't changed huge. But going back to those kind of 20 people, a lot of that was just getting all of the kind of basic tooling for like a developer portal and the ability to automate some of the governance functions, all that. But I want to put in perspective that what you're describing today is 4 people. For I don't know, what's the developer count at PayPal these days look like? Like how many total sort of engineers?
Maybe 4,000 developers, 4.5. I haven't kept the exact count, but it's somewhere around that or even more.
Yeah, which I just think I want to just call that out as you're describing all this. This isn't a team of 50 people. There's literally like a 1 to 1,000 scale of that function, right? Which I think I find remarkable. And to your point, this decentralizing, kind of federating control to what's typically been domain architects historically, right? That was one of the big ways to scale this. But I wanted to reel back. You said that that hasn't been working as well.
Yeah. So
is there some differing approach now?
Yeah. So the approach we took was, like I said, we built the business capability model. The first year after you left, Jason, what I did was, touring the whole world, right, across PayPal location, explaining our design standards, the guidelines, why you do your API this way, why it is required, what it means to our customers. Taking these sessions across our PayPal location and across levels, right, from an engineer through the leadership. So that was more kind of evangelization on what exists, what doesn't exist, what it means to you, what it means to your development. And while I was doing that, we rework on our business capability model, make it solid. At the same time, we did something called common components, if you remember. Mm-hmm. Right. So common components, although the name sounds it's something common across APIs, it evolved. It started with creating the common business entities for a domain, but it evolved over the period. It evolved to describe all of the domains domain model. Right. So while I was doing this evangelization across all PayPal location, I started working with the domain product manager and domain architect to build this domain model. Right. So over the period of a year and a half or two, we could build the domain model for all of our domains. So we established looking at our business capability model for all our business functions, we established a set of consistent business entities. So when you capture a construct in your APIs, you know what is that business entity you need to use. So that really laid the solid, building block for our V2 APIs. So if you see our V2 APIs, we'll talk about that later. You see whether it's a bank or a card, all these business entities, right, across our domains, they are consistent, they are described the same. So the federation, because the federation didn't work, I was focusing on what are the things I should be doing to scale this function, right? So establishing that domain model was first thing, along with the business capability model. Then I focused on tooling, right? So tooling was, so now we have consistent business entities across APIs, but we still need to ensure that the styling that we need to use in our APIs, they are followed in the same way everywhere. So again, so you can do it manually, which is not scalable. You can train
It's awful.
people, right? Oh,
It's awful.
and you cannot
You,
serve to
you,
each.
you
Yeah.
Jay and I both manually reviewed every PayPal API for like 6 months with no
Yeah.
tooling, and I can tell you, don't do it.
And
It's terrible.
yeah,
It's
and
maybe give an
that
example of what is when you say styling, what do you mean, and how do these domain models and business capability models help with that?
Yeah, so I'll talk both of them. So when you say styling, we have API standards and API style guide. These are very objective set of guidelines, meaning it can be so. If you call saying your URI should be a plural noun for a resource collection, or you should emit only these set of 400, 4xx or 5x errors for a get or a post, right? So these are very objective errors. So the API standards and guidelines, these patterns, all these could be automated. So what we did was we built a tooling to automate all these functions, all everything in API standard guidelines. So the API linter, which we started with just checking. When we started, we were using GDD, Google Discovery Document. Later, we migrated to OpenAPI. When we started, we had rules just to check, say, OpenAPI conformance, rules. But we evolved that linter to add everything that we wanted to do, rule checks. So be it the documentation checks, be it the OpenAPI conformance checks, our security checks, our privacy checks, right? Our the performance related SLO, those all those checks. Our domain whether a domain entity is used the right way or not, those checks, right? So when the validator or the API linter sees some word around currency or country code, it throws an error saying you need to use the PPAS common country code.json for country, right? When it sees something around pay, it throws an error saying you need to use a pay from, say, merchant common. So the validator, the moment in our process, when a developer raises a pull request for the review, this API linter automatically runs on the pull request and creates those set of errors. It's integrated with even the Sonar Cube. That means unless you fix those errors, you cannot merge the PR. So all of our API standard guidelines and everything other groups in the company wanted to do, like security or SRE team. So all those are enforced to the validator, and by the time the developer fixes those issues, we are in pretty good shape with respect to that API. So our business entities are consistent, our guidelines are met. So all we are looking at right now is the schema design aspect of your API. The things like what is the granularity of the API, right? Is it going to scale? Looking at things like is the API emitting anything internal, right? So these things can be done by domain architects. So by following the guidelines, so we have a checklist or guidelines to check these other aspect, non-functional aspect of the API. So we could once we automated through tooling the API standard checks and build the domain model, and then the process became very lighter, right? So it was then me providing or helping these domain architects whenever they have questions around schema design, right? And this process works beautifully for REST. We could scale it to GraphQL. We are now scaling to events, and we have an API, what do you call, tooling blueprint that is standardized in PayPal. So you bring any protocol, new API protocol, we are building these tools, right? And we have a domain model. We have the business capability model that doesn't change. whether it's REST or GraphQL or events. So that remains consistent, and we have a tooling blueprint for what we call. I'll talk more. We have again, divided that into two categories where you say SDLC tooling. In SDLC tooling blueprint, we have tools such as API linter, the API code gen, right? Then the API conformance tool. That is our SDLC tool. Then we have also standardized our patterns through a set of platform services. So we have a batch framework, right? We have a framework or service that can handle async requests over HTTP. Right? We have a file handling service. So all those patterns, set of platform services that we have developed for REST, it forms that platform services blueprint, and we are doing the same for GraphQL for events. Right. So we are in a state where the process framework, the tooling drives everything, right? And it became way easier. I did not now worry about losing any federated designer that I've trained, because the things we used to train, right, we don't need to train on those things anymore, because the tool process and the framework drives them, right? So I can focus on the schema design aspects of the protocol, and improving our standards, and talking to our developers and taking feedback, and improving all of this, be tooling on the process framework. So that's how we have scaled. So now whether I can see the difference now. So whether I am there, not there, right? It's like the things move, right, without anyone being bottleneck. So that is how.
If you had to guess at the number of issues that are caught automatically versus caught with the human review process, what's that ratio look like?
Yeah, so the number of issues that are caught automatically is like always 100%. Through this automated tooling versus manually. It requires someone to know everything, right? So if you are doing that as a full-time job, like say me or Jason, that we were doing together, you need to review through the APIs, look at every aspect of the API, right, and ensure
I think Adam was talking more about kind of these objective versus subjective things, right? So the objectives, sure, you can automate it all, but like there are subjective things that you're going to find. And I guess what does the typical proportion look like on, like, say, a domain architect finding some subjective factor versus how much is automatable?
Yeah, so the subjective factor is also we have automated through our domain model, right? Like I said, our linter, scrapes through words like payee, payer, country, currency, transaction, right? Then ensures that you don't use something that is or build or define something that is not already defined, right, in the domain model. So the subjective part, by defining our domain model, have reduced considerably, right? I would say it's almost maybe close to 5 to 10%, not more than that, right? Mm-hmm. Versus 5 years back, there was like 100%. The subjective aspect was there 100%. So because there was no domain model, nothing to depend on. So now it was responsibility on the developer to think about how they define a business entity. And as you know, if you change the developer, a new developer comes and develops the same API or some other API that requires same set of business entities, the definition do change, which leads to a lot of inconsistencies and not a great developer experience. You are seeing 20, 30 definition of same business entity. That is what happened to in our V2 API stack, right? Where we didn't have that. But yeah, over the period, by building the domain model, the subjective thing is almost gone right now. So we more and less now these domain architects, right, through the help of PPaaS, they're looking into these schema design aspects, which is to do with the granularity and internal anything. So error message, we even automated our error handling. I'll share how we automated. So there is no scope for anyone, right, to even if they try to accidentally do wrong things, they cannot do. The process, the framework, the controls are done so well.
So another interesting tidbit here, you've mentioned like, V2 and there's kind of like, multiple versions that folks can go see publicly on the APIs. So, I mean, there's two paths we can take here. I say we set aside deprecation and come back to it. But the first one is like, there's, internal, external developer portal. Like, what does that whole publishing kind of thing look like? I'm sure Adam's like frothing at the mouth to hear about this.
Yeah, I'll share again. My goal was always to scale. So what we did was we built a platform service called API Metadata Service. Okay, so what API Metadata Service essentially does is it gives everything about your API. So our external dev portal or internal dev portal, they are just clients of this API, right? And we have various controls in our APIs. We have a number of vendor extensions in our APIs where we annotate saying this is limited release, right? Meaning this is only partner public, where you don't see these APIs in our dev portal, right? And there are external set of APIs, then there are internal APIs. So within even an external API, there are fields that are internal, not exposed externally. So through these vendor extensions, we control the publication, and through the API metadata API, I'd say metadata API that we have, that gives you all these different views of your API. So a external dev portal can ask for a limited version of the API or external view of the API. By making a call to the metadata API, it will get a internal dev portal, the PPaaS, what we call PPaaS dev portal within PayPal. It calls the API to get a internal view of the API, right? So we control the entire API publication or getting any data or APIs, even downloading the API artifact, the Open API artifact through this metadata API, right? I would say the metadata API serves everything at PayPal. So not just publication, but for our tooling like SRE, they look into these to get the SLO information to enforce the performance, right, at runtime, monitor the performance. There are like regulatory folks, looking at the API to get the data that they can, submit to regulators just by, calling this API. Then there are folks in quality control that monitor the quality of each platform and domain by calling this API, and even raising, say, tickets, Jira tickets with the team if their API maturity goes down, right, automatically. So the API metadata service that we build serves central function to everything that we do, right? Be it publication or be it tooling or anything of that sort.
And it sounds like outside of determining what's visible, that you treat external, internal partner APIs the same. Is that?
Yeah, so I think that is the very clear guideline or assumption we made when we started developing our APIs. There is the guideline was to whenever we develop any API, think as if it's going to be externalized, right? And it worked very well for us. I have seen so many times. I think Jason where that a team would come up with a proposal saying, "Oh, this is an internal API. There are no clients," and that assumption changes very quickly. And after 2 weeks, the same team comes back saying, "Oh no, we have to now expose this to partner." And what we avoided since the beginning was not to think of developing any API for your internal or external segment as such, but develop an API based on the business capability model, based on the business functions, right, in a customer-centric way, and think about whether the internal external visibility as an identity function of that API, right? And so keeping those concerns separate and thinking to build API as a platform, right, that delivers a business value is the assumption we made in the beginning, or the guideline we set in the beginning, and that served us very, very well. So all the APIs that we build are currently used by our PayPal brands, the customers, our partners, the same way, right? And we can confidently externalize any API without much of issues. Right.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating thing to watch. In the years that I left PayPal, to see the partner development that PayPal's gone through in the last kind of 5 to 7 years. I mean, the stock price reflects some of that too, right? Like just huge number of massive partnerships, and they're all powered by APIs. And I think that mentality in the early days that. And in some ways, this is an extension of microservice thinking in general, is like you build the service around a customer-centric concept and make it easy to externalize. Because when that partnership opportunity comes, quite often it comes with a tight timeline, and you're able to just kind of flip the switch, or at least know what the gap is. And this is where, I guess, back to that kind of maturity model thing, right? Like, is this a very mature API or not? So yeah, fascinating stuff to watch from the outside now, and interesting to hear that that's really stood the test of time and proved itself. Very cool. Man, you touched on so many things already. I'm like, it's just a smorgasbord of topics we could dive into. I guess the deprecation one is interesting for me too. I know when I joined PayPal in I think it was 2013 or something, there was APIs dating back to 2001 that had never been turned off. I don't think people realize that. Right. It was in the ballpark of 15 years worth of different API form factors, SOAP and other made up stuff that was all still there. And my understanding is there's been a process of actually starting to deprecate things, and now you've moved from the V1 REST APIs to the V2. What's the learning been on deprecating in that process?
Yeah, I think the way the business we are in, right, in PayPal, it's very different from any other, right? So PayPal is all about trust, security, and we deal with money all the time. So when you're dealing with money, customers, if they are integrated with an API, they don't want to change, right? Because it's working and the trust factor is there. So it's very hard to move a customer, be it a partner or merchant, if it serves the business purpose that particular merchant or partner wants, right? Because it deals with money, right? So it's very difficult to move. So I think the path we have taken is, yes, we will evolve our APIs, right? There would be different protocols, and we will adapt them. Uh, um, um, for the new customers, we'll make sure that they are onto our new APIs. For our old customers, if they migrate to the new major version stack, great. If they do not, we still have our V2 API serve those V1 customers through facade kind of layer, right? So we are still reducing our tech debt, basically the infrastructure footprint, and routing all those traffic to our V2 stack. But at the same time, the customers or partner we are integrated with our APIs before, nothing changes for them, right? The business about money is like it's very different. I think in this world, no one wants to touch the integration if it's working, right? Uh, but
Yeah, it's hard to overemphasize the like lifeblood connection that payment APIs represent when it's processing all of someone's e-commerce. Like the risk and change is just often huge. It is super different. And like business model, all that too is just like, if the payment goes through, we make money. Like that's the PayPal perspective, right? Yeah. It's super simple from a monetization aspect. So if you do anything that stops that money from flowing, we stop getting paid. So it's like super equitable relationship, but super hard to push change on. But that's interesting to hear that V1 is essentially just a translation layer now, right?
Yeah, but I would like to say, so we have deprecation retirement. We are internally, we successfully do. We migrate our developers from V1 to V2 and retire that completely. But externally, this is the path I think we took. And from our experience, we learned, right? If you release an API externally, anything, if you want thinking of deprecating retirement, it's very expensive and costly, right? So we think of designing the API that can live for 10 or 15 years, right? So establishing all the process and all those was very important. Then while our APIs evolve, how can we reduce tech debt and still serve those old customers, right? And without affecting any of those integrations, and then serving the way through our new stack. We could still do that. We can still do that through our deprecation and versioning, and we follow them. It's the way our customers integrate that thing change.
So I'd imagine in some of this kind of linting and tooling and kind of the detecting breaking changes has to be a big one, right?
Yeah. Sorry, you're asking whether the change in tooling was a big one in terms of the evolution?
No. I'm just saying, like, as a, trying to put in perspective that in the span of the last 7 years that you've been around, there's only been 2 major versions, right? V1 and V2.
Right.
And so if someone's making a change to an API in a given domain that could be exposed to not only various internal domains, but to external partners, to external developers, that if you accidentally published a breaking change that could trigger a V3, that would be a huge deal. So I'd imagine you have detection methods to look for that early in the process, right?
Yeah. The API linter does that. Because even we don't deploy anything that is not there in the spec. So we treat our API specification as the release artifact. That means once the design review is done, where the linter runs all the linting rules, the API specification is merged to the in the API centralized API repo. The API specific artifact is released, is labeled, it's tagged, it's released to a central location, a repository. Then from there on, you generate the code, and that code is used by the service. So you need to use that code only through the dependency, right? So all these are so well done. The tooling, literally, you cannot do any wrong things here, right? So we detect everything through this tooling and the process. Yes.
All right. So, Jay, we're friends. We've known each other a long time, but there's something I do to almost every guest is, great, you spent, all these years building all this giant, enormous, complicated stuff, and it's beautiful and magical, and you've automated almost everything. Now imagine you have to start from scratch. You're just getting started. So what would be the first, what would be the things that even at a very small scale, you would still think are the best places to start and the best places to invest?
Yeah, if I have to start again doing this API program, I think the first thing I would do is establish what it means to your customers, right? So establish that the business capability model, build that domain model, and build all the tooling, right? So those are the three things I would do. And so when you start, generally you have more access to more funding, more people, and that is when you can complete all these things, right? And only I would say that the tooling and this process and the framework will help you scale, right? So starting with all these and completing them will scale your program for years, right? For that, and again, to do that, you need to have leadership support, right? So that they understand why you are doing this, why you need to build this, and how it is going to benefit your business, right? How the way you deliver your products, and so leadership buy-in is very important, right? So getting the leadership buy-in and building the tools, establishing the process, the framework, and building your customer-centric view of your APIs. So your API is your product, right? And you have to treat it that way. So whatever product you're delivering, that is your API, and your API delivers a business value. So establishing these core, I would say three main things, the important things: your business capability model, your domain model that captures all your business entities, then the tooling, both the SDLC tooling, right, and the platform services, right? So if I had to start, I would do these three things.
Well, as a guy who works in a team of 4 to support thousands of developers, it doesn't surprise me that you didn't hesitate a second on what's essential, because there's not room for much else. And I realized we didn't really touch on, like business capability model sounds like a big complicated thing. But I know my look at learning this from, again, our, my former colleague and your current one, Eric Hogan, is in its simplest terms, we're talking about kind of a collection of terms and definitions, right? Is there something more that you see to that?
Yeah, it's if you know about domain driven design. So yeah, basically it's set of terms and definition and your product function, right? That you deliver to a customer. So
what would be a recognizable few capabilities out of PayPal public APIs? How would you what terms would you use to describe those?
Yeah, so I describe both on the PayPal side, and if you as a company are starting to do this, how do you do that? So both of them. So from PayPal standpoint, you see our dev portal or our internal dev portal. They are all discoverable through the business capability and function. So you go to there are solution-centric views, and within solution, I think there are things like disputes, payments, billing agreements, right? These are the functions, subscriptions, right? So subscription is a product that helps with all of your subscription functionality. Payment does the payment processing. Dispute handles all of the customer dispute stuff, and each of these capability map one-on-one with an API, right? So these are
it's interesting as you're describing it. I'm browsing through the PayPal developer reference, and you're basically saying that the left-hand navigation are PayPal's core capabilities,
yes,
right?
Yes.
And it's funny,
Yeah.
I always forget that that's a really simple way to explain it, right? Is think about how would people navigate to find the things that you do at the simplest, in the simplest terms.
Yeah, you have to think about in a customer-centric way. So why your customers come to you, right? So they come to you because they want you to solve a business problem, right, for them. So when they come to you, they should be able to easily discover the capability that solves their problem. So if our dev portal whatever doesn't help a customer navigate to a capability that solves their business problem, then the documentation fails, right? So establishing that business core set of capabilities which makes the business capability model doesn't only help how you build your APIs, how you model APIs. It helps also for your customer to discover your APIs. It creates it defines a problem space for everyone in the company to think in a customer-centric way, right? So that is I would say, if you are building the API, that is the most important thing that you should do to begin with, right? So if you do that, you always deliver a API to build an API to deliver a business value, than building API to do a thing, right? Which is very different. Right. So
how do you describe the thing? That's what we hear from, I think, every guest who does, the kinds of things we do. It's like, what are the things, and how would you, what's the word you would use to describe it? I would note too that some of the navigation, like for instance, if I click into subscriptions, I see things like plan. So there's this notion of, I guess, kind of sub capability. How deep does that, kind of tree go?
Yeah, so there is what is the L1, L2, and L3 capability, right? So at the L1 level, you have a very high level view of your basically all of your products. So PayPal does a checkout, right? Does invoicing, dispute, and payment. These are and say risk, compliance. But say within compliance, there are things like policies, which is the L2 capability. So all the everything that you need to implement, build around policies falls into that L2 capability, right? Then there are regulatory restrictions, right? Where you build a set of APIs to meet your regulatory restrictions, related functions within a compliance, and same with say risk. Within risk, you can do say financial decisions. You also make identity related profile decisions, right? When someone is logging in, you want to ensure that it's a proper login. So profile decisions, financial decisions, these are L2 capabilities, right? And within those L2 capabilities, that the next level is L3, which really defines your business functions in that L2 capability. What you really do when you say plan, right? What you really do when you say financial decisions. So what is that business function? So our API is the internal dev portal. You wouldn't see externally, but the internal dev portal, our developers can navigate through any of these, routes. So they can start with the L1, and from there they can go to L2, and from there L3. Either
So
way,
are
right?
are there exceptional cases where there's L4s and 5s and 6 and 7 and so on, or is this
No,
sort of a
I
yeah?
think the pretty much at L3 we are like pretty much cover everything, right? So L3 is
Yeah,
like
and
really the leaf of your capability map. Yeah,
yeah,
or
it's a
tree, I would
fascinatingly
say.
simple concept though that I think we haven't really covered with other guests, and I think a lot of people do this. Is it's kind of an artificial constraint to say that like the way I always tell people is like if you can't describe something in 3 layers,
Yes.
it's you probably don't understand it.
Yeah.
But it applies both in terms of navigating to find things in a browsing sense, which is in some ways what we're describing, but this can translate down into how architecture is built out and all kinds of
Yes.
things. So it's fascinating that if you let hierarchy run wild, it implies that it's going to be difficult to comprehend, right? So, all right, man. With that,
One
I
other,
think
yeah,
yeah. Go ahead,
sorry,
Adam.
just
Yeah, you
one
go.
quick note. One other thing, Jay, that you said for advice to folks was to be able to get buy-in from leadership. And
Yeah.
it seems to me that starting with these business capabilities is a great way to do it because it's grounding something that could be this really complex technical thing into the actual way that customers use what you build. And so I
Yeah.
think that's a really
Exactly.
great place to start. Yeah.
Yeah. I think when you're talking to leadership, when you talk in terms of what it means for the business, can everyone can understand, right? Versus saying I want to build a great API for what, right? So I think starting from business modeling is a way to go and get buy-in from everyone in the company, right? Because everyone can relate to the work you are doing, and you can also, you know, they can monitor the investment that we are making into that. So yeah, everything becomes easier. Right.
Great.
Yeah, it's like so many things that we end up talking about here. It's like it's so simple, right? Like you go make a list of the things that your company does, and you think like, oh,
Yeah,
that's pretty
yeah,
straightforward. Describe it in 3 levels or
very,
less,
yeah,
with
right.
single words if you can.
Very straightforward. Yeah, right.
Takes
It's so
years.
simple and yeah, yeah,
I mean, even in small organizations, it can be hard. You know, everybody has a
yeah.
different idea of what it means, but I think this to me is where it's not actually an API design thing. This is platform design, right? How are we going to look across all the things that we do and describe them in one simple to understand way?
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and that drives everything else, right? The inverse Conway maneuver thing. So, well, as always, Jay, fascinating. I feel like this is one of those episodes we could just go on for hours and hours. But
Yeah,
as it is convincing, API focused folks to take out this much time is probably a big ask. So I'd say that's probably a great wrap point on some of the kind of tidbits you give listeners on how to get started. Anything that you'd like to kind of point folks to look at, to go kind of check out any of the latest news from PayPal?
yeah. So we will be publishing a lot of these and open sourcing. So our maturity model,
Mm-hmm.
the business capability model, right? Our PDLC, I think in coming months. So yeah, look forward to this. I hope the HTTP working group, the API working group that been recently formed, look into these aspects. So some of the tooling, the SDLC tooling, the platform tooling, these are like very set patterns, and even the API metadata. Why do you even take, or restart every time when you switch API protocols to build a new developer portal? Why not standardize that through something like your API metadata service, right? So there are many of these things I feel that can be standardized in the industry, right? So if we do that, our tooling, right, all the tooling that these API providers do, it just becomes easier for customers to adapt, to switch, change, right? Easily, right? Everything becomes portable. So yeah, look forward to. I would say look forward to the articles, the publications, or that we will open source in coming months, and I would say if the STDP working group, if we if we can standardize all these things, it will help many companies, developers, the tool providers, right? Everyone. It will create more choices for everyone, right?
Fantastic.
Yeah, so,
well, we'll definitely keep an eye out, and listeners, I guess, pay attention to PayPal and the HTTP working group. Well, thanks, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure. And listeners, thanks again. Thanks for listening. If you have a question you want to ask, look in the description of whichever platform you're viewing or listening on, and there should be a link there so you can go submit a question, and we'll do our best to find out the right answer for you.